The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor conference room as I adjusted my tie for the third time that morning. My hands were trembling slightly, not from the cold Chicago wind whistling outside, but from the weight of what this presentation meant for my career. 6 months of research, countless sleepless nights, and every ounce of my professional credibility were riding on the next 30 minutes. The Sterling and Associates conference room was designed to intimidate. Everything from the imported Italian marble floors to the original Monet hanging on the far wall screamed success and established power. The leather chairs around the massive mahogany table probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and the panoramic view of Lake Michigan served as a constant reminder of how high up we were in both the building and the corporate hierarchy. My boss, Richard Sterling, sat at the head of the mahogany table like a king surveying his kingdom. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Italian suit immaculate, and his expression as cold as the November weather outside. He had barely acknowledged my presence when I walked in, instead focusing his attention on the 3 executives from Meridian Industries who represented our biggest potential client of the year. I had arrived at the office at 5:30 that morning to make final adjustments to my presentation. The security guard, Miguel, had given me a knowing nod as he let me into the building. He had seen plenty of young consultants burning the midnight oil over the years, and he always had an encouraging word for those of us grinding our way up the ladder. "Big day today?" he had asked with his warm smile. "Yes, sir," I had replied. "The biggest." Little did I know how prophetic those words would prove to be. Please subscribe to our channel to help us bring more real stories like this one, and comment below to let us know where you're watching from around the world. I had been with Sterling and Associates for 3 years, working my way up from junior analyst to senior consultant. The journey had been grueling. My first year involved nothing but data entry and coffee runs, working 14-hour days for a salary that barely covered my student loan payments. My tiny studio apartment in Wicker Park was a 40-minute commute on the Blue Line, and I had eaten more ramen noodles than I cared to remember while building my career. But I had been strategic about every move. I volunteered for the projects no one else wanted, the ones that required traveling to unglamorous locations and spending weeks in manufacturing facilities and distribution centers. While my colleagues networked at downtown cocktail parties, I was in warehouses in Cleveland and assembly plants in Memphis, learning how businesses actually operated rather than just how they looked on paper. This presentation was supposed to be my moment, my chance to prove that I belonged at the big table. Richard had reluctantly agreed to let me lead the pitch after I had developed the entire strategy that could save Meridian Industries millions in operational costs. The decision hadn't come easily. I had to present my preliminary findings to him 3 times before he finally agreed that my approach had merit. Even then, he had insisted on reviewing every slide, every data point, every transition. He had made it clear that this was my one shot, and any mistake would reflect poorly on both of us. But from the moment the clients walked in, I could sense his discomfort with my presence in the spotlight. Richard Sterling had built his reputation on being the face of every major presentation. He was used to being the smartest person in the room, the one with all the answers. Having a subordinate lead a presentation for a client of this magnitude was clearly eating at him. The Meridian executives looked exactly like what you'd expect from Fortune 500 leadership. Margaret Chen, the chief operations officer, wore a navy blazer that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She had that polished confidence that came from years of boardroom battles, and her reputation in the industry was legendary. She had turned around 3 failing divisions in her career and was known for her no-nonsense approach to operational efficiency. Her assistant, David Rodriguez, frantically typed notes on his tablet while stealing glances at his watch. I could tell he was the type who managed Margaret's schedule down to the minute and was probably already thinking about their next appointment. The 3rd executive, James Morrison, the CFO, sat with his arms crossed, his face a mask of skeptical professionalism. I had done my research on all 3 of them. Morrison had a reputation for being particularly tough on consulting firms. He had publicly criticized the industry for charging premium prices for generic solutions, and he had personally terminated contracts with 2 major firms in the past year alone. If I could win him over, the contract was as good as signed. I stood up and clicked to my first slide, my voice steady despite the butterflies in my stomach. The presentation began smoothly. I had practiced this opening dozens of times in front of my bathroom mirror, timing every pause, every gesture, every transition. The slides were crisp, the data was solid, and I could see Margaret Chun nodding approvingly as I explained our analysis of their supply chain inefficiencies. I walked them through the specific bottlenecks that were costing them approximately $2.7 million annually. These weren't theoretical problems based on industry averages. These were issues I had personally observed during my time at their facilities. I had charts showing the exact inefficiencies in their Jacksonville and Phoenix distribution centers, data that no other consulting firm had because they hadn't bothered to do the on-site analysis. But then, just as I was transitioning to the implementation timeline, Richard cleared his throat loudly. The sound cut through the room like a knife, and all eyes turned to him. My heart sank as I recognized the look on his face, the same expression he wore when he was about to assert his dominance in a meeting. I had seen this look before, during internal presentations when a junior employee got too much positive attention from the partners. "If I may interrupt," Richard said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been told no. "I think what my colleague here is trying to say is that we need to approach this from a more traditional perspective." The word colleague stung like a slap across the face. Not team member, not senior consultant, not the person who had developed this entire strategy. But colleague, a deliberate diminishment of my role in front of the clients. I felt my cheeks burn as Richard stood up and walked to the front of the room, effectively pushing me aside like I was a junior analyst who had overstepped his bounds. "You see," Richard continued, clicking to bypass several of my carefully crafted slides without even glancing at their content. "In my 25 years of experience in this industry, I've learned that companies like Meridian Industries need solutions that are proven, not experimental." My stomach dropped as I watched him dismantle my presentation. The innovative approach I had developed, the one that could save them millions more than traditional methods, was being dismissed as experimental by someone who hadn't spent a single day analyzing their operations. Richard clicked through slide after slide, barely glancing at the content I had spent months perfecting, treating my work like it was a rough draft that needed his expert refinement. Margaret Chen's expression shifted from interested to confused. She looked between Richard and me, clearly sensing the tension in the room. I could see her trying to understand the dynamic she had just witnessed. As someone who had climbed the corporate ladder herself, she probably recognized the signs of an internal power struggle, but she was too professional to call it out directly. "Excuse me," she said, "but weren't we here to discuss the innovative approach that was outlined in the preliminary proposal? The one that showed potential savings of over $4 million annually." Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. His jaw tightened slightly at the mention of the specific numbers from my analysis. "Of course, Margaret, but sometimes innovation needs to be tempered with experience. What I'm proposing is a more conservative approach that aligns with industry best practices. It's the kind of proven methodology that has worked for companies like yours for decades." I stood there, feeling like a spectator at my own presentation, watching months of my work being repackaged as something completely different. The solution Richard was now pitching was generic, something any consulting firm could offer. It was safe, conventional, and would save Meridian Industries money, but nowhere near the amount my approach could achieve. More importantly, it completely ignored the unique challenges their company was facing, the challenges I had identified by actually spending time in their facilities instead of just reading their annual reports. James Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more skeptical by the minute. I could tell he was the type of executive who had heard countless consulting pitches over the years, and he had developed a sixth sense for detecting when someone was trying to sell him a cookie-cutter solution. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "the preliminary analysis we received was quite specific about the inefficiencies in our Jacksonville and Phoenix operations. Are you saying that analysis was incorrect?" David Rodriguez leaned forward in his chair, his tablet forgotten for the moment. "Mr. Sterling, the preliminary analysis we received showed potential savings of nearly $4 million annually. What you're presenting now seems to cap out at around $2 million. Can you explain the discrepancy? Our board specifically approved this meeting based on those higher projections." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I could see a bead of sweat forming on his forehead despite the conference room's perfect climate control. He was struggling to answer because he hadn't been involved in the detailed analysis. He had reviewed my slides, yes, but he hadn't done the fieldwork, hadn't spent hours with the operations managers, hadn't analyzed the actual data flows. That had been my work, my late nights, my expertise. Well, he said, his voice slightly less confident than usual. Sometimes initial projections can be overly optimistic. It's better to underpromise and overdeliver. In my experience, companies that chase unrealistic savings targets often end up disappointed and waste valuable resources on failed implementations. Margaret Chen exchanged a quick glance with James Morrison. I could see them processing what they were hearing, and it clearly wasn't what they had expected. They had come here based on a proposal that promised transformational results, and now they were being told that those results were unrealistic. That was my breaking point. I couldn't stand there and watch months of work be misrepresented. More importantly, I couldn't let these clients make a decision based on incomplete information. My father had always taught me that your reputation is built on the quality of your work and your willingness to stand behind it. I thought about all those nights I had spent in their warehouses, all the conversations with their employees, all the data I had carefully analyzed to arrive at my conclusions. Actually, I said, my voice cutting through Richard's explanation with more force than I had intended. If I may clarify the numbers and the methodology behind them, the silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Richard's eyes flashed with anger, but the clients were already looking at me with renewed interest. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, knowing that what I was about to do would probably end my career at Sterling and Associates, but also knowing that I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent. Margaret Chen gestured for me to continue, her expression showing genuine curiosity about what I had to say. Please, she said, we'd like to understand the discrepancy. I walked back to the presentation screen, my confidence returning as I clicked back to my detailed analysis. The slides that Richard had dismissed as experimental were actually the most thorough operational assessment that Meridian Industries had ever received. The $4 million projection isn't optimistic. It's based on specific inefficiencies we identified in your Jacksonville and Phoenix distribution centers. Mr. Sterling's approach would address the surface-level issues, but it wouldn't touch the root causes. I could feel Richard's glare burning into the back of my head, but I pressed on. The data was solid, and I knew it better than anyone in that room. For example, your current inventory management system is creating a cascade effect. When your Jacksonville center runs low on high-demand items, they're pulling stock from Phoenix, which then triggers emergency shipments from your manufacturers. Those emergency shipments alone are costing you $600,000 per quarter. That's $2.4 million per year just in one category of inefficiency. James Morrison sat up straighter, his skeptical expression replaced by focused attention. How did you identify that specific issue? Our internal audits haven't flagged anything like that. I spent 2 weeks on-site at both facilities, analyzing your actual workflow patterns rather than just reviewing the documentation. Most consulting firms rely on what companies tell them about their processes. We went deeper. I clicked to a slide showing a detailed flowchart of their current system versus my proposed optimization. The visual made the inefficiencies obvious even to someone without an operations background. I interviewed your warehouse supervisors, your logistics coordinators, your IT staff, and even some of your truck drivers. Each group told me a different story about how the system was supposed to work versus how it actually worked. The emergency shipments weren't showing up in your standard reports because they were being classified as priority fulfillment rather than emergency orders. Your Jacksonville manager, Maria Santos, told me that she had been requesting system updates for 2 years, but the requests kept getting lost in the approval process. Margaret Chen was taking notes now, her earlier confusion replaced by focused attention. This level of detail wasn't in Mr. Sterling's presentation. I could sense Richard shifting uncomfortably behind me. That's because Mr. Sterling wasn't involved in the site analysis, I said, immediately regretting how confrontational it sounded. But there was no taking it back now. The truth was the truth, and these executives deserved to know where their potential savings were actually coming from. David Rodriguez looked up from his tablet. You're saying our internal processes are hiding inefficiencies from our own management? Not intentionally, I replied quickly. But your reporting systems are designed to track what's supposed to happen, not what actually happens. When I mapped your actual inventory flows versus your documented procedures, the discrepancies were significant. Your Phoenix facility, for example, is sitting on $8 million worth of slow-moving inventory because your reorder algorithms don't account for seasonal variations in demand patterns specific to the Southwest market. The silence in the room was deafening. Richard's face had turned a shade of red that nearly matched his tie, and I could see his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The Meridian executives looked uncomfortable, clearly sensing they had walked into an internal power struggle that was now playing out in front of them. This was exactly the kind of corporate drama that sophisticated clients tried to avoid. Margaret Chin cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps, she said carefully, we could schedule a follow-up meeting to review both approaches in more detail. It seems like there are some internal discussions that need to happen at Sterling and Associates before we move forward. James Morrison nodded in agreement. We appreciate both perspectives, but we need to be confident that whoever we work with has a unified vision for the project. These kinds of discrepancies in a presentation don't inspire confidence. Of course, Richard said through gritted teeth, his professional composure barely intact. I'll have my assistant coordinate with your office to schedule something for next week. We'll come back with a more coherent presentation. As the clients gathered their materials and prepared to leave, I felt the weight of what had just happened settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. I had essentially undermined my boss in front of our biggest potential client. In the corporate world, that was career suicide, regardless of whether I was right or wrong. There were protocols, hierarchies, chains of command, and I had just violated all of them in the most public way possible. After the clients left, Richard and I were alone in the conference room. The rain had stopped, but the gray clouds outside seemed to match the atmosphere between us. He stood with his back to me, looking out at the city skyline. His hands clasped behind his back in a pose I had seen him strike countless times when he was thinking through a difficult decision. Pack up your office, Richard said quietly, still not turning around to face me. Security will escort you out by 5 p.m. Janet from HR will meet with you at 4:30 to discuss your separation package and non-disclosure agreement. I stared at the back of his head, even though I had expected this outcome from the moment I had spoken up. Richard, everything I presented was accurate. Those savings are real and you know it. The analysis is solid. He finally turned around, and I could see that his anger had been replaced by something colder, disappointment mixed with what might have been regret. What I know, he said, straightening his tie, is that you just made me look like a fool in front of a client. That's unforgivable in this business. I don't care how accurate your numbers are, but the client deserved to know the truth about what we could actually deliver for them, I said, knowing even as I spoke that I was digging my grave deeper. Richard walked closer to me, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more intimidating than if he had shouted. The truth? The truth is that I built this firm over 25 years by managing client expectations and delivering consistent results. You think you're the first bright young consultant who's ever walked through our doors with revolutionary ideas? I've seen dozens like you come and go. The ones who succeed learn to work within the system. The ones who don't. He gestured toward the door. I gathered my materials in silence, my mind racing. 3 years of building my career at Sterling and Associates, gone in 30 minutes. My reputation in the industry would be damaged. Richard had connections everywhere, and a negative reference from him could blacklist me from other firms. I thought about my student loans, my rent, my mother back in Detroit who was so proud that her son worked for a prestigious consulting firm in Chicago. But as I packed up my laptop and notes, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to slink away quietly like some disgraced junior analyst. If Richard wanted to destroy my career, I was going to make sure the truth came out first. I had spent 6 months developing a solution that could genuinely help Meridian Industries, and they deserved to know what they were potentially missing. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like it took forever. I passed colleagues in the hallway who had no idea what had just happened upstairs. Jennifer from accounting smiled and asked how the big presentation had gone. I gave her a generic fine and kept walking. By tomorrow, everyone in the office would know I had been fired, and by next week, the rumors would be spreading throughout Chicago's consulting community. Security escorted me to my desk to collect my personal belongings under the watchful eye of Janet from HR. It was humiliating but also oddly liberating. As I packed my few personal items, a photo of my family, my coffee mug from my MBA program, a small plant that had somehow survived 3 years under fluorescent lights, I realized how little of myself I had actually invested in this place. My colleagues tried not to stare, but I could feel their eyes on me as I walked through the office with my cardboard box. Some looked sympathetic, others looked nervous, probably wondering if they could be next. Sarah from the tax division mouthed, "Call me," as I passed her desk. At least I would have one friend who might be willing to hear my side of the story. That evening, I sat in my small apartment in Lincoln Park, staring at my laptop screen while the city lights twinkled outside my window. The apartment was barely 600 square feet, with a Murphy bed that doubled as my home office when folded up against the wall. 3 years of working at Sterling and Associates, and this was still all I could afford in Chicago. But it was mine, and tonight it felt like a sanctuary from the corporate warfare I had just experienced. I had Margaret Chen's business card from the meeting, and her email address was listed on Meridian Industries' website. What I was considering could make me unemployable in Chicago's tight-knit consulting community, but staying silent felt like betraying everything I had worked for. I thought about my father, who had spent 30 years as a factory supervisor in Detroit before the plant closed down. He had always told me that hard work and integrity would eventually pay off, but he had also been laid off twice through no fault of his own. Maybe the corporate world wasn't so different from the factory floor after all. I began typing, "Dear Ms. Chun, I wanted to follow up on today's meeting and provide some additional context regarding the 2 approaches that were presented." I spent the next 2 hours crafting an email that was professional, factual, and devastating. Every sentence was carefully constructed to provide information without seeming desperate or vindictive. I attached the complete analysis that Richard had glossed over, including the detailed financial projections and implementation timeline that showed exactly how we could save them over $4 million annually. I explained the methodology behind my recommendations, the weeks I had spent on-site at their facilities, and provided case studies from similar companies where this approach had succeeded. Most importantly, I made it clear that I was no longer with Sterling and Associates and that reaching out was my personal decision, not a business development tactic. I included my personal contact information and sent the email before I could second-guess myself. As soon as I hit send, I felt a mixture of terror and relief wash over me. There was no taking it back now. The next 3 days were the longest of my professional life. I had no job, limited savings that would last maybe 2 months if I was careful, and no idea if I had just made the biggest mistake of my career. My small emergency fund felt even smaller when I thought about Chicago rent prices and the student loan payments that would keep coming regardless of my employment status. I spent the time updating my resume and reaching out to my network, preparing for a long job search in an industry where reputation was everything. I called former colleagues, reaching out to classmates from business school, and even contacted professors who might know of opportunities. Every conversation felt like I was walking on eggshells, trying to explain why I had left Sterling and Associates without bad-mouthing Richard or revealing the details of what had happened. My friend Sarah, who worked at a competing firm, took me out for coffee on Wednesday afternoon. We met at a small cafe in the Loop, just a few blocks from the Sterling and Associates building that I could no longer enter. "What really happened?" she asked, sensing there was more to the story than I was telling. Sarah had been in the industry long enough to know that senior consultants didn't just quit without having another job lined up. I gave her the sanitized version, creative differences, different visions for the project, the usual corporate euphemisms. But I could tell she wasn't buying it. "Richard Sterling has a reputation," she said carefully. "He's brilliant, but he doesn't like to share the spotlight. There are rumors about how he's treated other up-and-coming consultants over the years." She didn't need to say more. We both understood the unspoken politics of our industry. On Thursday morning, My phone rang at exactly 9:15 a.m. The caller ID showed Meridian Industries, and my heart nearly stopped. I had been preparing myself for rejection, for the possibility that my email had damaged whatever small chance I might have had with them. "This is Margaret Chen," the voice on the other end said, and I could hear the bustle of a busy office in the background. "I received your email, and I have to say, it was quite enlightening. We've been discussing it internally since yesterday afternoon." My heart pounded so hard I was sure she could hear it through the phone. "Ms. Chun, I hope you understand that my intention wasn't to create any drama or badmouth my former employer. I simply felt that you deserved complete information before making a decision that could affect your company for years to come." "Actually," she said, and I could hear papers rustling as she spoke, "that's exactly why I'm calling. We've reviewed your complete analysis with our operations team, and frankly, it's the most thorough consulting proposal we've ever received. The level of detail and the potential impact far exceed anything Sterling and Associates presented in the meeting. Our Jacksonville facility manager confirmed every single inefficiency you identified, and our CFO is particularly interested in your inventory optimization recommendations." I could barely believe what I was hearing. Not only were they not angry about my email, but they were actually impressed by the work I had done. "I appreciate that, Ms. Chun, but I should mention that I'm no longer with Sterling and Associates, obviously." "We know," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "We called their office yesterday to request a follow-up meeting with you specifically, and they told us you were no longer with the company. Mr. Sterling seemed quite uncomfortable when we asked about you. That's actually why I'm calling. Would you be interested in discussing this project as an independent consultant?" The question hit me like a lightning bolt. Independent consulting was something I had always considered for the future, not something I thought I'd be forced into at this stage of my career. But here was the opportunity of a lifetime, offered by one of the biggest companies in their industry. "I would be very interested," I managed to say, "but I should be transparent. I've never run my own consulting practice before." Margaret Chen laughed. "Honestly, that might be an advantage. The big firms often get set in their ways. Your approach was fresh, innovative, and most importantly, it was based on actual analysis rather than cookie-cutter solutions." We scheduled a meeting for the following Monday. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. In the span of a week, I had gone from having a secure job to being unemployed to potentially landing the biggest client of my career as an independent consultant. The meeting on Monday took place at Meridian Industries headquarters, a gleaming tower in the loop that made Sterling and Associates offices look modest by comparison. The building was a testament to American industrial success, with a lobby that featured a timeline of the company's innovations dating back to 1952. As I waited in the reception area, I watched employees hurrying to meetings, their confident strides and purposeful expressions reminding me of what I was hoping to become, someone who belonged in this world of high-stakes business decisions. Margaret Chen introduced me to her full leadership team, including the CEO, Robert Harrison, who had specifically requested to meet the consultant behind the innovative proposal. Harrison was younger than I had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of intense focus that suggested he had earned his position through results rather than politics. The conference room we met in had a wall of awards and recognitions, including several Supplier of the Year awards from Fortune 500 companies. "I'll be honest," the CEO said as we sat in his corner office overlooking Lake Michigan, the same lake I could see from the Sterling and Associates building but from a much higher floor. "We were impressed with your analysis, but we're taking a risk hiring someone who just started their own practice. What assurances can you give us that you can deliver on these projections?" It was a fair question, and I had spent the weekend preparing for it. I had researched similar implementations at other companies, calculated risk factors, and developed contingency plans for every potential obstacle I could imagine. "You're right that this would be my first major independent project," I said. "But every projection in my analysis is based on verifiable data from your own operations. I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. I'm proposing a phased implementation where we start with the highest impact, lowest risk changes first. If those don't deliver the projected results within 60 days, you can terminate the contract with no penalty." The CEO exchanged glances with Margaret Chin. They had clearly discussed this possibility before I arrived. That's a level of accountability we've never seen from a consulting firm, Harrison said. Most consultants want their money up front and disappear once the contract is signed. That's because I believe in the solution, I said. When you've spent weeks walking through someone's facilities, talking to their employees, and analyzing their actual processes, you develop confidence in your recommendations. 3 hours later, I walked out of Meridian Industries with a signed contract worth $250,000. More than twice what Sterling and Associates would have charged for their generic solution. More importantly, I had the opportunity to prove that my approach could deliver the results I had promised. As I stood on the sidewalk outside their building, holding the contract in my hands, I felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror that I had never experienced before. The implementation took 4 months of the most intense work of my life. I essentially became a temporary employee at Meridian Industries, spending my days in their facilities and my evenings analyzing data and refining processes. I worked with their warehouse managers, their IT staff, their logistics coordinators, and their floor supervisors. Everyone had opinions about how things should be done, and part of my job was to navigate the internal politics while implementing changes that would actually work. The first phase focused on their inventory management system, and within 6 weeks, we had reduced their emergency shipment costs by 60%. The second phase addressed their distribution routing, which saved them another $800,000 per quarter. By the end of the third phase, when we had optimized their supplier coordination protocols, the results exceeded even my projections. The changes we made to their inventory management and distribution processes saved Meridian Industries $4.3 million in the first year. More importantly, the improvements were sustainable and would continue generating savings for years to come. Every projection in my original presentation had been conservative, and the actual results proved that my methodology was sound. Margaret Chin became my first advocate in the industry, referring me to other companies facing similar challenges. Within a year, my independent practice had grown to include 5 major clients and had generated more revenue than I had ever imagined possible. But the most satisfying moment came 8 months after leaving Sterling and Associates. I was at an industry conference in downtown Chicago when I ran into Richard Sterling at the networking reception. He looked older, and I later learned that Meridian Industries' success with my approach had led several other clients to question Sterling and Associates' methodologies. "Congratulations on your success," he said, though the words seemed to taste bitter in his mouth. "I heard Meridian is very happy with your work." "Thank you, Richard," I replied. "I learned a lot during my time at your firm." He nodded, then surprised me by saying, "In retrospect, maybe I should have listened more carefully to your presentation that day." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was as close as someone like Richard Sterling would ever come to admitting he had been wrong. I realized in that moment that I wasn't angry with him anymore. His decision to cut off my presentation and then fire me had ultimately led to the best opportunity of my career. "Sometimes things work out the way they're supposed to," I said. As I walked away from that conversation, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that rainy November morning in the conference room. Getting fired had been devastating at the time, but it had forced me to bet on myself in a way I never would have otherwise. The clients had signed with me not because I was the safe choice, but because I had offered them something genuine: thorough analysis, innovative solutions, and the courage to stand behind my work even when it was unpopular. Looking back, I realized that the most important lesson from that experience wasn't about consulting or business strategy. It was about the value of authenticity in a world that often rewards conformity. Richard Sterling had built his career on playing it safe, on delivering what clients expected rather than what they needed. That approach had worked for him for 25 years, but it had also made him fearful of new ideas and threatened by anyone who might challenge the status quo. My independent practice continued to grow, and I eventually hired a small team of analysts who shared my commitment to thorough, innovative work. We developed a reputation for taking on the challenging projects that other firms wouldn't touch, and for delivering results that exceeded expectations. The conference room where my career at Sterling and Associates ended is probably still there on the 42nd floor, still hosting presentations and power struggles. But I think about that rainy November morning differently now. It wasn't the day my boss cut off my pitch. It was the day I learned that sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as disasters. The clients didn't sign with me despite what happened in that meeting. They signed with me because of it. Because in that moment of confrontation, they saw someone who cared more about delivering results than about playing corporate politics. That's the lesson that has guided every decision I've made since. When you have conviction in your work and the courage to stand behind it, even the worst-case scenario can become the foundation for something better than you ever imagined possible.